Chapter 22. Sunday Below Ground. I awoke on Sunday morning without any sense of hurry and bustle attendant on an immediate departure, though the day to be devoted to repose and reflection was spent under such strange circumstances, and in so wonderful a place. The idea was a pleasant one. Besides, we all began to get used to this kind of existence. I had almost ceased to think of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, of the trees, houses and towns, in fact, about any terrestrial necessities. In our peculiar position we were far above such reflections. The grotto was a vast and magnificent hall. Along its granitic soil the stream flowed placidly and pleasantly. So great a distance was it now from its fiery source that its water was scarcely lukewarm and could be drunk without delay or difficulty. After a frugal breakfast, the professor made up his mind to devote some hours to putting his notes and calculations in order. In the first place, he said, I have a good many to verify and prove, in order that we may know our exact position. I wish to be able on our return to the upper regions to make a map of our journey, a kind of vertical section of the globe, which will be, as it were, the profile of the expedition. That would indeed be a curious work, uncle, but can you make your observations with anything like certainty and precision? I can. I have never on any occasion failed to note with great care the angles and slopes. I am certain as to having made no mistake. Take the compass and examine how she points. I looked at the instrument with care. East 1/4 southeast. Very good, resumed the professor, noting the observation and going through some rapid calculations. I make out that we have journeyed 250 miles from the point of our departure. Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads. Certainly. And at this very moment it is possible that fierce tempests are raging above, and that men and ships are battling against the angry blasts just over our heads. It is quite within the range of possibility, rejoined my uncle, smiling. And that whales are playing in shoals, thrashing the bottom of the sea, the roof of our adamantine prison. Be quite at rest on that point. There is no danger of their breaking through. But to return to our calculations, we are to the southeast, 250 miles from the base of Sneffels, and according to my preceding notes, I think we have gone 16 leagues in a downward direction. 16 leagues, 50 miles, I cried. I am sure of it. But that is the extreme limit allowed by science for the thickness of the Earth's crust, I replied, referring to my geological studies. I do not contravene that assertion, was his quiet answer. And at this stage of our journey, according to all known laws on the increase of heat, there should be here a temperature of 1500 degrees of Reaumur. There should be, you say, my boy. In which case this granite would not exist, but be in a state of fusion. But you perceive, my boy, that it is not so, and that facts, as usual, are very stubborn things, overruling all theories. I am forced to yield to the evidence of my senses, but I am nevertheless very much surprised. What heat does the thermometer really indicate? Continued the philosopher. 27/6. So that science is wrong by 1474 degrees and 4/10, according to which it is demonstrated that the proportional increase in temperature is an exploded error. Humphrey Davy here shines forth in all his glory. He is right. And I have acted wisely to believe him. Have you any answer to make to this statement? Had I chosen to have spoken, I might have said a great deal. I in no way admitted the theory of Humphrey Davy. I still held out for the theory of proportional increase of heat, though I did not feel it. I was far more willing to allow that this chimney of an extinct volcano was covered by lava of a kind refractory to heat, in fact, a bad conductor which did not allow the great increase of temperature to percolate through its sides. The hot water jet supported my view of the matter. But without entering on a long and useless discussion or seeking for new arguments to controvert my uncle, I contented myself with taking up facts as they were. Well, sir, I take for granted that all your calculations are correct, but allow me to draw from them a rigorous and definite conclusion. Go on, my boy, have your say, cried my uncle good-humoredly. At the place where we now are, under the latitude of Iceland, the terrestrial depth is about 1583 leagues, 1583 and a quarter. Well, Suppose we say 1600 in round numbers. Now, out of a voyage of 1600 leagues we have completed 16. As you say, what then? At the expense of a diagonal journey of no less than 85 leagues. Exactly. We have been 20 days about it. Exactly 20 days. Now 16 is the 100th part of our contemplated expedition. If we go on in this way we shall be 2,000 days, that is about 5 years and a half, going down. The professor folded his arms, listened, but did not speak. Without counting that if a vertical descent of 16 leagues costs us a horizontal of 85, we shall have to go about 8,000 leagues to the southeast, and we must therefore come out somewhere in the circumference long before we can hope to reach the center. Bother your calculations, cried my uncle in one of his old rages. On what basis do they rest? How do you know that this passage does not take us direct to the end we require? Moreover, I have in my favor, fortunately, a precedent. What I have undertaken to do, another has done, and he having succeeded, why should I not be equally successful? I hope, indeed, you will, but still, I suppose I may be allowed to. You are allowed to hold your tongue, cried Professor Hardwigg, when you talk so unreasonably as this. But I saw at once that the old doctorial professor was still alive in my uncle, and fearful to rouse his angry passions, I dropped the unpleasant subject. Now, then, he explained, consult the manometer. What does that indicate? A considerable amount of pressure. Very good. You see then that by descending slowly, and by gradually accustoming ourselves to the density of this lower atmosphere, we shall not suffer. Well, I suppose not, except it may be a certain amount of pain in the ears, was my rather grim reply. That, my dear boy, is nothing, and you will easily get rid of that source of discomfort by bringing the exterior air in communication with the air contained in your lungs. Perfectly, said I, for I had quite made up my mind in no wise to contradict my uncle. I should fancy almost that I should experience a certain amount of satisfaction in making a plunge into this dense atmosphere. Have you taken note of how wonderfully sound is propagated? Of course I have. There can be no doubt that a journey into the interior of the earth would be an excellent cure for deafness. But then, uncle, I ventured mildly to observe, this density will continue to increase. Yes, according to a law which, however, is scarcely defined. It is true that the intensity of weight will diminish just in proportion to the depth to which we go. You know very well that it is on the surface of the earth that its action is most powerfully felt, while on the contrary, in the very center of the earth bodies cease to have any weight at all. I know that is the case, but as we progress will not the atmosphere finally assume the density of water? I know it when placed under the pressure of 710 atmospheres, cried my uncle with imperturbable gravity. And when we are still lower down, I asked with natural anxiety. Well, lower down, the density will become even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog? Well, my worthy nephew, we must ballast ourselves by filling our pockets with stones, said Professor Hardwigg. Faith, uncle, you have an answer for everything, was my only reply. I began to feel that it was unwise of me to go any farther into the wide field of hypotheses, for I should certainly have revived some difficulty, or rather impossibility, that would have enraged the professor. It was evident, nevertheless, that the air under a pressure which might be multiplied by thousands of atmospheres would end by becoming perfectly solid, and that then, admitting our bodies resisted the pressure, we should have to stop, in spite of all the reasonings in the world. Facts overcome all arguments. But I thought it best not to urge this argument. My uncle would simply have quoted the example of Saknussemm. Supposing the learned Icelander's journey ever really to have taken place, there was one simple answer to be made. In the 16th century, neither the barometer nor the manometer had been invented. How, then, could Saknussemm have been able to discover when he did reach the center of the earth? This unanswerable and learned objection I, however, kept to myself and, bracing up my courage, awaited the course of events, little aware of how adventurous yet were to be the incidents of our remarkable journey. The rest of this day of leisure and repose was spent in calculation and conversation. I made it a point to agree with the professor in everything, but I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without taking any such trouble about the cause and effect, went blindly onwards wherever destiny chose to lead him. Chapter 23. Alone. It must in all truth be confessed, things as yet had gone on well, and I should have acted in bad taste to have complained. If the true medium of our difficulties did not increase, it was within the range of possibility that we might ultimately reach the end of our journey. Then what glory would be ours? I began in the newly aroused ardor of my soul to speak enthusiastically to the professor. Well, was I serious? The whole state in which we existed was a mystery, and it was impossible to know whether or not I was in earnest. For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid. Some were even of a most frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were forever going down into the solid interior mass. During some days we actually descended 1.5 leagues, even 2 leagues towards the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide, Hans. Without him we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and thanks to him, many a dangerous pass was got over, where but for him we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant? During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this particular period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory, even now, makes my soul shudder and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say that there were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles, of rocks and oceans and continents and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. On that memorable day the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was on this occasion walking on in front. My uncle had charge of one of the Ruhmkorff coils, I had possession of the other. By means of its light I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning round, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is to go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps and, while doing so, walked for at least 1/4 of an hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul. I called aloud, no reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began for the first time to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my whole body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be 2 roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do is to go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I had ever seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, well knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no, the most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, said I to myself. Since there is only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still to go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me, and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, if I make haste, I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener had there been one that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas and to reunite them under the form of reasoning, required some time. I could not all at once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage on his shoulder. I now remembered this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as was possible, there is another sure means of not losing my way, a thread to guide me through the labyrinthine subterraneous retreat, one which I had forgotten, my faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle, when he refused to allow the eider hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind, before I started upwards, that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite. The stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared. Chapter 24. Lost. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to die in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically I crawled about, feeling the dry and arid rock. Never to my fancy had I ever felt anything so dry. But I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed when last I tried if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths had my companions gone? Where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark there was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in 3 awful words. Lost, lost, lost. Lost at a depth which, to my finite understanding, appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders like the globe on the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house on the Königstrasse, my dear cousin Gretchen, all that world which had before vanished like a shadow floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal. Under the influence of a terrible hallucination, I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me like the scenes of a panorama. The ship and its inmates, Iceland, M. Fredriksson, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that, if in my position I retained the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth, and ready, too, to split asunder, to rend in twain those huge and mighty vaults which stand above my head? Who could enable me to find my road and regain my companions? Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle," was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips, for I thoroughly understood how deeply and sorrowfully the worthy professor would regret my loss, and how in his turn he would patiently seek for me. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had recourse to prayer. And little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked, I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had at first wholly forgotten: 3 days' provisions. Moreover, my water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. But which course should I take? Should I go upwards, or again descend? Doubtless it was right to retrace my steps in an upward direction. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once at this spot, once the river at my feet, I could, at all events, regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. Why had I not thought of this before? This, at last, was a reasonable hope of safety. The most important thing, then, to be done was to discover the bed of the Hansbach. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult. But I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest, and knows there is only one road to follow. During 1 whole hour nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced, I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel, to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before. But no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate, and fell inanimate on the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock. Lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction, without guide, clue or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die. To lie down and die the most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day perhaps, when my fossil bones were found, their discovery so far below the level of the earth might give rise to solemn and interesting scientific discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler and paler and paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. Every instant it seemed to me that it was about to vanish and to leave me forever in utter darkness. At last, one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated upon it all the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see. And then I was to be lost forever in Cimmerian and tenebrous shades. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows a complete destruction and extinction of its power. Light is so diffuse, so subtle, that it permeates everywhere, and whatever little may remain, the retina of the eye will succeed in finding it. In this place nothing, the absolute obscurity, made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling in getting against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I knew not what I did. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth, always going downwards, running wildly underneath the terrestrial crust, like an inhabitant of the subterranean furnaces, screaming, roaring, howling, until bruised by the pointed rocks. Falling and picking myself up all covered with blood, seeking madly to drink the blood which dripped from my torn features, mad because this blood only trickled over my face. And watching always for this horrid wall, which ever presented to me the fearful obstacle against which I could not dash my head. Where was I going? It was impossible to say. I was perfectly ignorant of the matter. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell a heavy inert mass along the side of the tunnel and lost consciousness. Chapter 25. The Whispering Gallery. When at last I came back to a sense of life and being, my face was wet, but wet, as I soon knew, with tears. How long this state of insensibility lasted, it is quite impossible for me now to say. I had no means left to me of taking any account of time. Never since the creation of the world had such a solitude as mine existed. I was completely abandoned. After my fall, I lost much blood. I felt myself flooded with the life-giving liquid. My first sensation was perhaps a natural one. Why was I not dead? Because I was alive, there was something left to do. I tried to make up my mind to think no longer. As far as I was able, I drove away all ideas, and utterly overcome by pain and grief, I crouched against the granite wall. I just commenced to feel the fainting coming on again, and the sensation that this was the last struggle before complete annihilation when, on a sudden, a violent uproar reached my ears. It had some resemblance to the prolonged rumbling voice of thunder, and I clearly distinguished sonorous voices, lost one after the other, in the distant depths of the gulf. Whence came this noise? Naturally, it was to be supposed from new phenomena which were taking place in the bosom of the solid mass of Mother Earth. The explosion of some gaseous vapors, or the fall of some solid, of the granitic or other rock. Again I listened with deep attention. I was extremely anxious to hear if this strange and inexplicable sound was likely to be renewed. A whole quarter of an hour elapsed in painful expectation. Deep and solemn silence reigned in the tunnel, so still that I could hear the beatings of my own heart. I waited with a strange kind of hopefulness. Suddenly my ear, which leaned accidentally against the wall, appeared to catch, as it were, the faintest echo of a sound. I thought that I heard vague, incoherent, and distant voices. I quivered all over with excitement and hope. It must be hallucination, I cried. It cannot be. It is not true. But no. By listening more attentively, I really did convince myself that what I heard was truly the sound of human voices. To make any meaning out of the sound, however, was beyond my power. I was too weak even to hear distinctly. Still, it was a positive fact that someone was speaking. Of that I was quite certain. There was a moment of fear. A dread fell upon my soul that it might be my own words brought back to me by a distant echo. Perhaps without knowing it, I might have been crying aloud. I resolutely closed my lips and once more placed my ear to the huge granite wall. Yes, for certain. It was in truth the sound of human voices. I now, by the exercise of great determination, dragged myself along the sides of the cavern until I reached a point where I could hear more distinctly. But though I could detect the sound, I could only make out uncertain, strange, and incomprehensible words. They reached my ear as if they had been spoken in a low tone, murmured, as it were, afar off. At last I made out the word forlorad repeated several times in a tone betokening great mental anguish and sorrow. What could this word mean, and who was speaking it? It must be either my uncle or the guide Hans. If, therefore, I could hear them, they must surely be able to hear me. "Help," I cried at the top of my voice, "help! I am dying." I then listened with scarcely a breath. I panted for the slightest sound in the darkness, a cry, a sigh, a question. But silence reigned supreme. No answer came. In this way some minutes passed. A whole flood of ideas flashed through my mind. I began to fear that my voice, weakened by sickness and suffering, could not reach my companions who were in search of me. It must be they, I cried. Who else could by any possibility be buried 100 miles below the level of the earth? The mere supposition was preposterous. I began, therefore, to listen again with the most breathless attention. As I moved my ears along the side of the place I was in, I found a mathematical point, as it were, where the voices appeared to attain their maximum of intensity. The word forlorad again distinctly reached my ear. Then came again that rolling noise like thunder which had awakened me out of torpor. I begin to understand. I said to myself after some little time devoted to reflection, it is not through the solid mass that the sound reaches my ears. The walls of my cavernous retreat are of solid granite, and the most fearful explosion would not make uproar enough to penetrate them. The sound must come along the gallery itself. The place I was in must possess some peculiar acoustic properties of its own. Again I listened, and this time, yes, this time I heard my name distinctly pronounced, cast as it were into space. It was my uncle, the professor, who was speaking. He was in conversation with the guide, and the word which had so often reached my ears, forlorad, was a Danish expression. Then I understood it all. In order to make myself heard, I too must speak as it were along the side of the gallery, which would carry the sound of my voice, just as the wire carries the electric fluid from point to point. But there was no time to lose. If my companions were only to remove a few feet from where they stood, the acoustic effect would be over. My whispering gallery would be destroyed. I again therefore crawled towards the wall, and said as clearly and distinctly as I could, "Uncle Hardwigg." I then awaited a reply. Sound does not possess the property of traveling with such extreme rapidity. Besides, the density of the air at that depth from light and motion was very far from adding to the rapidity of circulation. Several seconds elapsed, which to my excited imagination appeared ages, and these words reached my eager ears and moved my wildly beating heart. "Harry, my boy, is that you?" A short delay between question and answer. "Yes, yes." "Where are you?" "Lost." "And your lamp?" "Out, out. But the guiding stream is lost." Keep your courage, Harry. We will do our best." "One moment, my uncle," I cried. "I have no longer strength to answer your questions. But for heaven's sake, do you continue to speak to me?" Absolute silence, I felt, would be annihilation. "Keep up your courage," said my uncle. "As you are so weak, do not speak. We have been searching for you in all directions, both by going upwards and downwards in the gallery. My dear boy, I had begun to give over all hope, and you can never know what bitter tears of sorrow and regret I have shed. At last, supposing you to be still on the road beside the Hansbach, we again descended, firing off guns as signals. Now, however, that we have found you, and that our voices reach each other, it may be a long time before we actually meet. We are conversing by means of some extraordinary acoustic arrangement of the labyrinth. But do not despair, my dear boy. It is something gained even to hear each other." While he was speaking, my brain was at work reflecting. A certain undefined hope, vague and shapeless as yet, made my heart beat wildly. In the first place, it was absolutely necessary for me to know one thing. I once more, therefore, leaned my head against the wall, which I almost touched with my lips, and again spoke. "Uncle, say." "My boy," was his answer after a few moments. "It is of the utmost consequence that we should know how far we are asunder." "That is not difficult." "You have your chronometer at hand?" I asked. "Certainly." "Well, take it into your hand. Pronounce my name, noting exactly the second at which you speak. I will reply as soon as I hear your words, and you will then note exactly the moment at which my reply reaches you." "Very good, and the mean time between my question and your answer will be the time occupied by my voice in reaching you." "That is exactly what I mean, uncle," was my eager reply. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Well, make ready. I am about to pronounce your name," said the professor. I applied my ear close to the sides of the cavernous gallery, and as soon as the word Harry reached my ear, I turned round and, placing my lips to the wall, repeated the sound. 40 seconds, said my uncle. There has elapsed 40 seconds between the two words. The sound, therefore, takes 20 seconds to ascend. Now, allowing 1,020 feet for every second, we have 20,400 feet, a league and a half, and 1/8. These words fell on my soul like a kind of death knell. "A league and a half," I muttered in a low and despairing voice. "It shall be got over, my boy," cried my uncle in a cheery tone. "Depend on us." "But do you know whether to ascend or descend?" I asked faintly enough. "We have to descend, and I will tell you why. You have reached a vast open space, a kind of bare crossroad, from which galleries diverge in every direction. That in which you are now lying must necessarily bring you to this point, for it appears that all these mighty fissures, these fractures of the globe's interior, radiate from the vast cavern which we at this moment occupy. Rouse yourself, then, have courage, and continue your route. Walk if you can, if not, drag yourself along slide, if nothing else is possible. The slope must be rather rapid, and you will find strong arms to receive you at the end of your journey. Make a start, like a good fellow." These words served to rouse some kind of courage in my sinking frame. "Farewell for the present, good uncle. I am about to take my departure. As soon as I start, our voices will cease to commingle. Farewell, then, until we meet again." "Adieu, Harry, until we say welcome," such were the last words which reached my anxious ears before I commenced my weary and almost hopeless journey. This wonderful and surprising conversation, which took place through the vast mass of the earth's labyrinth, these words exchanged, the speakers being about 5 miles apart, ended with hopeful and pleasant expressions. I breathed one more prayer to heaven. I sent up words of thanksgiving, believing in my inmost heart that he had led me to the only place where the voices of my friends could reach my ears. This apparently astounding acoustic mystery is easily explainable by simple natural laws. It arose from the conductibility of the rock. There are many instances of this singular propagation of sound which are not perceptible in its less immediate positions. In the interior gallery of St. Paul's, and amid the curious caverns in Sicily, these phenomena are observable. The most marvelous of them all is known as the ear of Dionysius. These memories of the past, of my early reading and studies, came fresh to my thoughts. Moreover, I began to reason that if my uncle and I could communicate at so great a distance, no serious obstacle could exist between us. All I had to do was to follow the direction whence the sound had reached me, and logically putting it, I must reach him if my strength did not fail. I accordingly rose to my feet. I soon found, however, that I could not walk, that I must drag myself along. The slope, as I expected, was very rapid, but I allowed myself to slip down. Soon the rapidity of the descent began to assume frightful proportions and menaced a fearful fall. I clutched at the sides, I grasped at projections of rocks, I threw myself backwards. All in vain. My weakness was so great I could do nothing to save myself. Suddenly earth failed me. I was first launched into a dark and gloomy void. I then struck against the projecting asperities of a vertical gallery, a perfect well. My head bounded against a pointed rock, and I lost all knowledge of existence. As far as I was concerned, death had claimed me for his own. Chapter 26. A rapid recovery. When I returned to the consciousness of existence, I found myself surrounded by a kind of semi-obscurity, lying on some thick and soft coverlets. My uncle was watching, his eyes fixed intently on my countenance, a grave expression on his face, a tear in his eye. At the first sigh which struggled from my bosom, he took hold of my hand. When he saw my eyes open and fix themselves upon his, he uttered a loud cry of joy. "He lives! He lives!" "Yes, my good uncle," I whispered. "My dear boy," continued the grim professor, clasping me to his heart, "you are saved." I was deeply and unaffectedly touched by the tone in which these words were uttered, and even more by the kindly care which accompanied them. The professor, however, was one of those men who must be severely tried in order to induce any display of affection or gentle emotion. At this moment our friend Hans, the guide, joined us. He saw my hand in that of my uncle, and I venture to say that, taciturn as he was, his eyes beamed with lively satisfaction. "God dag," he said. "Good day, Hans." "Good day," I replied, in as hearty a tone as I could assume. "And now, uncle, that we are together, tell me where we are. I have lost all idea of our position, as of everything else." "Tomorrow, Harry, tomorrow," he replied. "Today you are far too weak. Your head is surrounded with bandages and poultices that must not be touched. Sleep, my boy, sleep, and tomorrow you will know all that you require." But I cried, "Let me know what o'clock it is, what day it is." "It is now 11 o'clock at night, and this is once more Sunday. It is now the 9th of the month of August, and I distinctly prohibit you from asking any more questions until the 10th of the same." I was, if the truth were told, very weak indeed, and my eyes soon closed involuntarily. I did require a good night's rest, and I went off reflecting at the last moment that my perilous adventure in the interior of the earth, in total darkness, had lasted 4 days. On the morning of the next day, at my awakening, I began to look around me. My sleeping place, made of all our traveling bedding, was in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, glittering in all the colors of the rainbow, the floor of soft and silvery sand. A dim obscurity prevailed. No torch, no lamp was lighted, and yet certain unexplained beams of light penetrated from without and made their way through the opening of the beautiful grotto. I, moreover, heard a vague and indefinite murmur, like the ebb and flow of waves upon a strand, and sometimes I verily believed I could hear the sighing of the wind. I began to believe that, instead of being awake, I must be dreaming. Surely my brain had not been affected by my fall, and all that occurred during the last 24 hours was not the frenzied visions of madness. And yet, after some reflection, a trial of my faculties, I came to the conclusion that I could not be mistaken. Eyes and ears could not surely both deceive me. It is a ray of the blessed daylight, I said to myself, which has penetrated through some mighty fissure in the rocks. But what is the meaning of this murmur of waves, this unmistakable moaning of the salt sea billows? I can hear, too, plainly enough, the whistling of the wind, but can I be altogether mistaken, if my uncle, during my illness, has but carried me back to the surface of the earth? Has he, on my account, given up his wondrous expedition, or in some strange manner has it come to an end? I was puzzling my brain over these and other questions when the professor joined me. "Good day, Harry," he cried in a joyous tone. "I fancy you are quite well." "I am very much better," I replied, actually sitting up in my bed. "I knew that would be the end of it, as you slept both soundly and tranquilly. Hans and I have each taken turn to watch, and every hour we have seen visible signs of amelioration." "You must be right, uncle," was my reply, "for I feel as if I could do justice to any meal you could put before me." "You shall eat, my boy, you shall eat. The fever has left you. Our excellent friend Hans has rubbed your wounds and bruises with I know not what ointment, of which the Icelanders alone possess the secret. And they have healed your bruises in the most marvelous manner. Ah, he's a wise fellow, is Master Hans." While he was speaking, my uncle was placing before me several articles of food, which, despite his earnest injunctions, I readily devoured. As soon as the first rage of hunger was appeased, I overwhelmed him with questions, to which he now no longer hesitated to give answers. I then learned, for the first time, that my providential fall had brought me to the bottom of an almost perpendicular gallery. As I came down, amidst a perfect shower of stones, the least of which falling on me would have crushed me to death, they came to the conclusion that I had carried with me an entire dislocated rock. Riding, as it were, on this terrible chariot, I was cast headlong into my uncle's arms, and into them I fell, insensible and covered with blood. "It is indeed a miracle," was the professor's final remark, "that you were not killed 1,000 times over. But let us take care never to separate, for surely we should risk never meeting again. Let us take care never again to separate." These words fell with a sort of chill upon my heart. The journey, then, was not over. I looked at my uncle with surprise and astonishment. My uncle, after an instant's examination of my countenance, said, "What is the matter, Harry?" "I want to ask you a very serious question. You say that I am all right in health." "Certainly you are." "And all my limbs are sound and capable of new exertion?" I asked. "Most undoubtedly." "But what about my head?" was my next anxious question. "Well, your head, except that you have 1 or 2 contusions, is exactly where it ought to be on your shoulders," said my uncle, laughing. "Well, my own opinion is that my head is not exactly right. In fact, I believe myself slightly delirious." "What makes you think so?" "I will explain why I fancy I have lost my senses," I cried. "Have we not returned to the surface of Mother Earth?" "Certainly not." "Then truly I must be mad, for do I not see the light of day? Do I not hear the whistling of the wind? And can I not distinguish the wash of a great sea?" "And that is all that makes you uneasy," said my uncle, with a smile. "Can you explain?" "I will not make any attempt to explain, for the whole matter is utterly inexplicable. But you shall see and judge for yourself. you will then find that geological science is as yet in its infancy, and that we are doomed to enlighten the world. Let us advance. Then I cried eagerly, no longer able to restrain my curiosity. Wait a moment, my dear Harry, he responded. You must take precautions after your illness before going into the open air. The open air. Yes, my boy. I have to warn you that the wind is rather violent and I have no wish for you to expose yourself without necessary precautions. But I beg to assure you that I am perfectly recovered from my illness. Have just a little patience, my boy. A relapse would be inconvenient to all parties. We have no time to lose as our approaching sea voyage may be of long duration. Sea voyage, I cried, more bewildered than ever. Yes, you must take another day's rest, and we shall be ready to go on board by tomorrow, replied my uncle, with a peculiar smile. Go on board, the words utterly astonished me. Go on board what and how? Had we come upon a river, a lake? Had we discovered some inland sea? Was a vessel lying at anchor in some part of the interior of the earth? My curiosity was worked up to the very highest pitch. My uncle made vain attempts to restrain me. When at last, however, he discovered that my feverish impatience would do more harm than good, and that the satisfaction of my wishes could alone restore me to a calm state of mind, he gave way. I dressed myself rapidly, and then, taking the precaution to please my uncle, of wrapping myself in one of the coverlets, I rushed out of the grotto. Chapter 27. The Central Sea. At first I saw absolutely nothing. My eyes, wholly unused to the effulgence of light, could not bear the sudden brightness, and I was compelled to close them. When I was able to reopen them, I stood still, far more stupefied than astonished. Not all the wildest effects of imagination could have conjured up such a scene. The sea, I cried. Yes, replied my uncle, in a tone of pardonable pride, the Central Sea. No future navigator will deny the fact of my having discovered it, and hence of acquiring a right of giving it a name. It was quite true. A vast, limitless expanse of water, the end of a lake if not of an ocean, spread before us, until it was lost in the distance. The shore, which was very much indented, consisted of a beautiful soft golden sand, mixed with small shells, the long deserted home of some of the creatures of a past age. The waves broke incessantly and with a peculiarly sonorous murmur, to be found in underground localities. A slight frothy flake arose as the wind blew along the pellucid waters, and many a dash of spray was blown into my face. The mighty superstructure of rock which rose above to an inconceivable height left only a narrow opening, but where we stood, there was a large margin of strand. On all sides were capes and promontories and enormous cliffs, partially worn by the eternal breaking of the waves through countless ages, and as I gazed from side to side, the mighty rocks faded away like a fleecy film of cloud. It was in reality an ocean, with all the usual characteristics of an inland sea, only horribly wild, so rigid, cold and savage. One thing startled and puzzled me greatly. How was it that I was able to look upon that vast sheet of water instead of being plunged in utter darkness? The vast landscape before me was lit up like day. But there was wanting the dazzling brilliancy, the splendid irradiation of the sun, the pale, cold illumination of the moon, the brightness of the stars. The illuminating power in this subterranean region, from its trembling and recurring character, its clear, dry whiteness, the very slight elevation of its temperature, its great superiority to that of the moon, was evidently electric, something in the nature of the aurora borealis. Only that its phenomena were constant, and able to light up the whole of the ocean cavern. The tremendous vault above our heads, the sky, so to speak, appeared to be composed of a conglomeration of nebulous vapors, in constant motion. I should originally have supposed that, under such an atmospheric pressure as must exist in that place, the evaporation of water could not really take place, and yet from the action of some physical law which escaped my memory, there were heavy and dense clouds rolling along that mighty vault, partially concealing the roof. Electric currents produced astonishing play of light and shade in the distance, especially around the heavier clouds. Deep shadows were cast beneath, and then suddenly between two clouds there would come a ray of unusual beauty and remarkable intensity, and yet it was not like the sun, for it gave no heat. The effect was sad and excruciatingly melancholy. Instead of a noble firmament of blue, studded with stars, there was above me a heavy roof of granite, which seemed to crush me. Gazing around, I began to think of the theory of the English captain who compared the Earth to a vast hollow sphere in the interior of which the air is retained in a luminous state by means of atmospheric pressure, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpine, circled there in their mysterious orbits. After all, suppose the old fellow was right. In truth, we were imprisoned, bound, as it were, in a vast excavation. Its width it was impossible to make out the shore, on either hand, widening rapidly until lost to sight, while its length was equally uncertain. A haze on the distant horizon bounded our view. As to its height, we could see that it must be many miles to the roof. Looking upward, it was impossible to discover where the stupendous roof began. The lowest of the clouds must have been floating at an elevation of 2,000 yards, a height greater than that of terrestrial vapors, which circumstance was doubtless owing to the extreme density of the air. I use the word cavern in order to give an idea of the place. I cannot describe its awful grandeur. Human language fails to convey an idea of its savage sublimity. Whether this singular vacuum had or had not been caused by the sudden cooling of the earth, when in a state of fusion, I could not say. I had read of most wonderful and gigantic caverns, but none in any way like this. The great grotto of Guachara, in Colombia, visited by the learned Humboldt, the vast and partially explored Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, what were these holes in the earth to that in which I stood in speechless admiration? With its vapory clouds, its electric light, and the mighty ocean slumbering in its bosom. Imagination, not description, can alone give an idea of the splendor and vastness of the cave. I gazed at these marvels in profound silence. Words were utterly wanting to indicate the sensations of wonder I experienced. I seemed, as I stood upon that mysterious shore, as if I were some wandering inhabitant of a distant planet, present for the first time at the spectacle of some terrestrial phenomena belonging to another existence. To give body and existence to such new sensations would have required the coinage of new words, and here my feeble brain found itself wholly at fault. I looked on, I thought, I've reflected, I admired, in a state of stupefaction not altogether unmingled with fear. The unexpected spectacle restored some color to my pallid cheeks. I seemed to be actually getting better under the influence of this novelty. Moreover, the vivacity of the dense atmosphere reanimated my body by inflating my lungs with unaccustomed oxygen. It will be readily conceived that after an imprisonment of 47 days, in a dark and miserable tunnel, it was with infinite delight that I breathed this saline air. It was like the genial, reviving influence of the salt sea waves. My uncle had already got over the first surprise. With the Latin poet Horace, his idea was that, "Not to admire is all the art I know. To make man happy and to keep him so." "Well," he said, after giving me time thoroughly to appreciate the marvels of this underground sea, "do you feel strong enough to walk up and down?" "Certainly," was my ready answer. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure." "Well then, my boy," he said, "lean on my arm, and we will stroll along the beach." I accepted his offer eagerly, and we began to walk along the shores of this extraordinary lake. To our left were abrupt rocks, piled one upon the other, a stupendous titanic pile. Down their sides leaped innumerable cascades, which at last, becoming limpid and murmuring streams, were lost in the waters of the lake. Light vapors, which rose here and there, and floated in fleecy clouds from rock to rock, indicated hot springs, which also poured their superfluity into the vast reservoir at our feet. Among them I recognized our old and faithful stream, the Hansbach, which, lost in that wild basin, seemed as if it had been flowing since the creation of the world. "We shall miss our excellent friend," I remarked, with a deep sigh. "Bah," said my uncle testily, "what matters it? That or another, it is all the same." I thought the remark ungrateful, and felt almost inclined to say so, but I forbore. At this moment my attention was attracted by an unexpected spectacle. After we had gone about 500 yards, we suddenly turned a steep promontory, and found ourselves close to a lofty forest. It consisted of straight trunks with tufted tops, in shape like parasols. The air seemed to have no effect upon these trees, which in spite of a tolerable breeze remained as still and motionless as if they had been petrified. I hastened forward. I could find no name for these singular formations. Did they not belong to the 2,000 and more known trees, or were we to make the discovery of a new growth? By no means. When we at last reached the forest, and stood beneath the trees, my surprise gave way to admiration. In truth, I was simply in the presence of a very ordinary product of the earth, of singular and gigantic proportions. My uncle unhesitatingly called them by their real names. It is only, he said, in his coolest manner, a forest of mushrooms. On close examination, I found that he was not mistaken. Judge of the development attained by this product of damp, hot soils. I had heard that the Lycoperdon giganteum reaches 9 feet in circumference, but here were white mushrooms, nearly 40 feet high, and with tops of equal dimensions. They grew in countless thousands. The light could not make its way through their massive substance, and beneath them reigned a gloomy and mystic darkness. Still, I wished to go forward. The cold in the shades of this singular forest was intense. For nearly an hour we wandered about in this visible darkness. At length I left the spot, and once more returned to the shores of the lake, to light and comparative warmth. But the amazing vegetation of subterraneous land was not confined to gigantic mushrooms. New wonders awaited us at every step. We had not gone many 100 yards, when we came upon a mighty group of other trees with discolored leaves, the common humble trees of Mother Earth, of an exorbitant and phenomenal size, lycopods, 100 feet high, flowering ferns as tall as pines, gigantic grasses. Astonishing, magnificent, splendid. Cried my uncle, here we have before us the whole flora of the second period of the world, that of transition. Behold the humble plants of our gardens, which in the first ages of the world were mighty trees. Look around you, my dear Harry. No botanist ever before gazed on such a sight. My uncle's enthusiasm, always a little more than was required, was now excusable. You are right, uncle, I remarked. Providence appears to have designed the preservation in this vast and mysterious hothouse of antediluvian plants, to prove the sagacity of learned men in figuring them so marvelously on paper. Well said. My boy, very well said. It is indeed a mighty hothouse, but you would also be within the bounds of reason and common sense if you added that it is also a vast menagerie. I looked rather anxiously around. If the animals were as exaggerated as the plants, the matter would certainly be serious. A menagerie. Doubtless. Look at the dust we are treading underfoot. Behold the bones with which the whole soil of the seashore is covered. Bones, I replied. Yes, certainly, the bones of antediluvian animals. I stooped down as I spoke, and picked up 1 or 2 singular remains, relics of a bygone age. It was easy to give a name to these gigantic bones, in some instances as big as trunks of trees. Here is, clearly, the lower jawbone of a mastodon, I cried, almost as warmly and enthusiastically as my uncle. Here are the molars of the Dinotherium. Here is a leg bone which belonged to the Megatherium. You are right, uncle. It is indeed a menagerie for the mighty animals to which these bones once belonged. I have lived and died on the shores of this subterranean sea, under the shadow of these plants. Look, yonder are whole skeletons, and yet, nephew, said my uncle, noticing that I suddenly came to a full stop. I do not understand the presence of such beasts in granite caverns, however vast and prodigious, was my reply. Why not, said my uncle, with very much of his old professional impatience. Because it is well known that animal life only existed on Earth during the secondary period, when the sedimentary soil was formed by the alluviums, and thus replaced the hot and burning rocks of the primitive age. I have listened to you earnestly and with patience, Harry, and I have a simple and clear answer to your objections, and that is, that this itself is a sedimentary soil. How can that be at such enormous depth from the surface of the earth? The fact can be explained both simply and geologically. At a certain period, the earth consisted only of an elastic crust, liable to alternative upward and downward movements in virtue of the law of attraction. It is very probable that many a landslip took place in those days, and that large portions of sedimentary soil were cast into huge and mighty chasms. Quite possible, I dryly remarked. But, uncle, if these antediluvian animals formerly lived in these subterranean regions, what more likely than that one of these monsters may at this moment be concealed behind one of yonder mighty rocks? As I spoke, I looked keenly around, examining with care every point of the horizon, but nothing alive appeared to exist on these deserted shores. I now felt rather fatigued, and told my uncle so. The walk and excitement were too much for me in my weak state. I therefore seated myself at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves broke in incessant rolls. I looked round a bay formed by projections of vast granitic rocks. At the extreme end was a little port protected by huge pyramids of stones. A brig and 3 or 4 schooners might have lain there with perfect ease. So natural did it seem, that every minute my imagination induced me to expect a vessel coming out under all sail and making for the open sea under the influence of a warm southerly breeze. But the fantastic illusion never lasted more than a minute. We were the only living creatures in this subterranean world. During certain periods there was an utter cessation of wind, when a silence deeper, more terrible than the silence of the desert, fell upon these solitary and arid rocks, and seemed to hang like a leaden weight upon the waters of this singular ocean. I sought, amid the awful stillness, to penetrate through the distant fog, to tear down the veil which concealed the mysterious distance. What unspoken words were murmured by my trembling lips, what questions did I wish to ask and did not? Where did this sea end, to what did it lead? Should we ever be able to examine its distant shores? But my uncle had no doubts about the matter. He was convinced that our enterprise would in the end be successful. For my part, I was in a state of painful indecision. I desired to embark on the journey and to succeed, and still I feared the result. After we had passed an hour or more in silent contemplation of the wondrous spectacle, we rose and went down towards the bank on our way to the grotto, which I was not sorry to gain. After a slight repast, I sought refuge in slumber, and at length, after many and tedious struggles, sleep came over my weary eyes. Chapter 28. Launching the raft. On the morning of the next day, to my great surprise, I awoke completely restored. I thought a bath would be delightful after my long illness and sufferings. So soon after rising, I went and plunged into the waters of this new Mediterranean. The bath was cool, fresh, and invigorating. I came back to breakfast with an excellent appetite. Hans, our worthy guide, thoroughly understood how to cook such eatables as we were able to provide. He had both fire and water at discretion, so that he was enabled slightly to vary the weary monotony of our ordinary repast. Our morning meal was like a capital English breakfast, with coffee by way of a wind-up, and never had this delicious beverage been so welcome and refreshing. My uncle had sufficient regard for my state of health not to interrupt me in the enjoyment of the meal, but he was evidently delighted when I had finished. "Now then," said he, "come with me. It is the height of the tide, and I am anxious to study its curious phenomena." What, I cried, rising in astonishment. "Did you say the tide, uncle?" "Certainly I did." "You do not mean to say," I replied, in a tone of respectful doubt, "that the influence of the sun and moon is felt here below?" "And pray why not? Are not all bodies influenced by the law of universal attraction? Why should this vast underground sea be exempt from the general law, the rule of the universe? Besides, there is nothing like that which is proved and demonstrated, despite the great atmospheric pressure down here. You will notice that this inland sea rises and falls with as much regularity as the Atlantic itself." As my uncle spoke, we reached the sandy shore, and saw and heard the waves breaking monotonously on the beach. They were evidently rising. "This is truly the flood," I cried, looking at the water at my feet. "Yes, my excellent nephew," replied my uncle, rubbing his hands with the gusto of a philosopher, "and you see by these several streaks of foam that the tide rises at least 10 or 12 feet. It is indeed marvelous." "By no means," he responded. "On the contrary, it is quite natural." "It may appear so in your eyes, my dear uncle," was my reply, "but all the phenomena of the place appear to me to partake of the marvelous. It is almost impossible to believe that which I see. Who in his wildest dreams could have imagined that, beneath the crust of our earth, there could exist a real ocean, with ebbing and flowing tides, with its changes of winds, and even its storms? I for one should have laughed the suggestion to scorn." "But Harry, my boy, why not?" inquired my uncle, with a pitying smile. "Is there any physical reason in opposition to it?" "Well, if we give up the great theory of the central heat of the earth, I certainly can offer no reasons why anything should be looked upon as impossible." "Then you will own," he added, "that the system of Sir Humphrey Davy is wholly justified by what we have seen." "I allow that it is, and that point once granted, I certainly can see no reason for doubting the existence of seas and other wonders, even countries, in the interior of the globe." That is so, but of course these varied countries are uninhabited. Well, I grant that it is more likely than not still. I do not see why this sea should not have given shelter to some species of unknown fish. Hitherto we have not discovered any, and the probabilities are rather against our ever doing so, observed the professor. I was losing my skepticism in the presence of these wonders. Well, I am determined to solve the question. It is my intention to try my luck with my fishing line and hook. Certainly make the experiment, said my uncle, pleased with my enthusiasm. While we are about it, it will certainly be only proper to discover all the secrets of this extraordinary region. But after all, where are we now? I asked. All this time I have quite forgotten to ask you a question, which doubtless your philosophical instruments have long since answered. Well, replied the professor, examining the situation from only one point of view, we are now distant 350 leagues from Iceland. So much was my exclamation. I have gone over the matter several times, and am sure not to have made a mistake of 500 yards, replied my uncle positively. And as to the direction, are we still going to the southeast? Yes, with a western declination of 19 degrees, 42 minutes, just as it is above. As for the inclination, I have discovered a very curious fact. What may that be, uncle? Your information interests me. Why, that the needle, instead of dipping towards the pole as it does on Earth, in the northern hemisphere, has an upward tendency. This proves, I cried, that the great point of magnetic attraction lies somewhere between the surface of the Earth and the spot we have succeeded in reaching. Exactly, my observant nephew, exclaimed my uncle, elated and delighted, and it is quite probable that if we succeed in getting toward the polar regions, somewhere near the 73rd degree of latitude, where Sir James Ross discovered the magnetic pole, we shall behold the needle point directly upward. We have therefore discovered by analogy that this great center of attraction is not situated at a very great depth. Well, said I, rather surprised. This discovery will astonish experimental philosophers. It was never suspected. Science, great, mighty, and in the end unerring, replied my uncle dogmatically. Science has fallen into many errors which have been fortunate and useful rather than otherwise, for they have been the stepping stones to truth. After some further discussion, I turned to another matter. Have you any idea of the depth we have reached? We are now, continued the professor, exactly 35 leagues above 100 miles down into the interior of the Earth. So, said I, after measuring the distance on the map, we are now beneath the Scottish Highlands, and have over our heads the lofty Grampian Hills. You are quite right, said the professor, laughing. It sounds very alarming, the weight being heavy, but the vault which supports this vast mass of earth and rock is solid and safe. The mighty architect of the universe has constructed it of solid materials. Man, even in his highest flights of vivid and poetic imagination, never thought of such things. What are the finest arches of our bridges, what the vaulted roofs of our cathedrals, to that mighty dome above us, and beneath which floats an ocean with its storms and calms and tides? I admire it all as much as you can, uncle, and have no fear that our granite sky will fall upon our heads. But now that we have discussed matters of science and discovery, what are your future intentions? Are you not thinking of getting back to the surface of our beautiful Earth? This was said more as a feeler than with any hope of success. Go back, nephew, cried my uncle in a tone of alarm. You are not surely thinking of anything so absurd or cowardly. No, my intention is to advance and continue our journey. We have as yet been singularly fortunate, and henceforth I hope we shall be more so. But, said I, how are we to cross yonder liquid plain? It is not my intention to leap into it head foremost, or even to swim across it, like Leander over the Hellespont. But as oceans are, after all, only great lakes, inasmuch as they are surrounded by land, so does it stand to reason that this central sea is circumscribed by granite surroundings. Doubtless, was my natural reply. Well then, do you not think that when once we reach the other end we shall find some means of continuing our journey? Probably, but what extent do you allow to this internal ocean? Well, I should fancy it to extend about 40 or 50 leagues more or less. But even supposing this approximation to be a correct one, what then? I asked. My dear boy, we have no time for further discussion. We shall embark tomorrow. I looked around with surprise and incredulity. I could see nothing in the shape of boat or vessel. What I cried, we are about to launch out upon an unknown sea, and where, if I may ask, is the vessel to carry us? Well, my dear boy, it will not be exactly what you would call a vessel. For the present we must be content with a good and solid raft. A raft, I cried, incredulously, but down here a raft is as impossible of construction as a vessel, and I am at a loss to imagine. My good Harry, if you were to listen instead of talking so much, you would hear, said my uncle, waxing a little impatient. I should hear. Yes, certain knocks with the hammer, which Hans is now employing to make the raft. He has been at work for many hours. Making a raft? Yes. But where has he found trees suitable for such a construction? He found the trees all ready to his hand. Come, and you shall see our excellent guide at work. More and more amazed at what I heard and saw, I followed my uncle like one in a dream. After a walk of about a quarter of an hour, I saw Hans at work on the other side of the promontory which formed our natural port. A few minutes more and I was beside him. To my great surprise, on the sandy shore lay a half-finished raft. It was made from beams of a very peculiar wood, and a great number of limbs, joints, boughs, and pieces lay about, sufficient to have constructed a fleet of ships and boats. I turned to my uncle, silent with astonishment and awe. Where did all this wood come from? I cried. What wood is it? Well, there is pine wood, fir, and the palms of the northern regions, mineralized by the action of the sea, he replied, sententiously. Can it be possible? Yes, said the learned professor, what you see is called fossil wood. But then, cried I, after reflecting for a moment, like the lignites, it must be as hard and as heavy as iron, and therefore will certainly not float. Sometimes that is the case. Many of these woods have become true anthracites, but others again, like those you see before you, have only undergone one phase of fossil transformation. But there is no proof like demonstration, added my uncle, picking one or two of these precious waifs and casting them into the sea. The piece of wood, after having disappeared for a moment, came to the surface and floated about with the oscillation produced by wind and tide. Are you convinced, said my uncle, with a self-satisfied smile. I am convinced, I cried, that what I see is incredible. The fact was that my journey into the interior of the earth was rapidly changing all preconceived notions, and day by day preparing me for the marvelous. I should not have been surprised to have seen a fleet of native canoes afloat upon that silent sea. The very next evening, thanks to the industry and ability of Hans, the raft was finished. It was about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. The beams, bound together with stout ropes, were solid and firm, and once launched by our united efforts, the improvised vessel floated tranquilly upon the waters of what the professor had well named the Central Sea.